Hello and welcome to the CFB Super Show. I'm your host, Walter Waddell, aka Dub Deuces 85, joined as always each and every week on the college football side by my good friend, co-host Jay Kuchek. We're, of course, presented by the FTN Network. We are entering the last few weeks of the college football season. Pretty bittersweet. Really kind of the final, I guess, regular season type of slate here. We'll have a military-based random showdown later, conference championships coming up, and then we'll be right into bowl season. It's crazy. This season has just gone so fast. I remember us just like barely starting to talk about Nick Nash and USC and Huskies, and now we're really just kind of getting down to the end here. A really big slate coming up, a big just lots of football. The Egg Bowl tomorrow, showdown slate. Then we have a 10-gamer on Friday, which is what we're going to be talking about tonight. There's also a 3-game later slate on Friday. And then, of course, diving into the 12 games main slate Saturday. And there's just all kinds of football. Real quick recap of last week. We stubbornly went back to Ollie Gordon, said man, this guy's just too good. He can't be bad. He had a rough start and people were moaning and groaning. And then suddenly he has that blow up, huge game, and it worked out for us. And last week overall was a pretty good one. So just had to revisit there, Ollie Gordon, and how well he just did. All right. So before we get into it, just to kind of let new people know, or if you're a returner and you need a recap, we are going to break down the 10-game main slate from DraftKings perspective. We'll talk a little bit about FanDuel too as well. We will give a core at the end for each site. We'll also talk about some PrizePicks and any betting opportunities and prop stuff at the end as well. If you're watching live or on demand, please make sure you hit the like button. Also interact whether you're on demand or live, because we come back and check the comments later. Share the show as well. All those interactions really, really help us out. Jake, you did a little bit of action yesterday. It's crazy as usual. Appreciate you jumping on again tonight. How are you feeling, man? The season's just kind of flown by, but looking at the overall body of work, I feel like we've done a good job and a real solid chance to end the year on a high note.
Yeah, man, it is crazy. You're right. I do remember, very, very first show and Nick Nash in all his glory, and it's just flown by since. But yeah, it was good to jump on the action. Six quarterbacks in consideration on a 2-game slate. It's always fun. It's a different brand of football they play in the action. But and going back to last week, Ollie Gordon, it was like, that meme. It's like, oh, well, we had him in the first half, and it kind of felt like that, right? And like, I'm glad there wasn't an option to like sub in somebody else at halftime. Like that's not really how DFS works, because I probably would have been like, oh, can't pay $9K for a guy that's doing scrub work, and he just went off in the second half. That was crazy. So yeah, it was good to be on him. Wasn't quite as good to be on Elijah Badger. He had an okay game, and he had a billion targets. I think he had like 14 targets. Didn't produce to the same level as I was kind of hoping, and was not one of my hits on the stat line of the week, but definitely had the opportunity to do so. It's just little tough with the trio of quarterbacks that they have throwing the ball to them. I say that because one is a tight end and one is a running back, and so it's makes things interesting with that kind of offense. But definitely a lot of opportunity for Elijah Badger. If they ever get a real quarterback throwing the ball, look out, because he's a stud
for sure. And it kind of the slate did, Gordon having that slow start and panicking. And then, as Estime scored, he didn't have the biggest game ever, 20 fantasy points. And then again, JMU on the slate, they kind of had a letdown there. Ended up getting kind of lucky because, I kept deciding between Reggie Brown and Surratt. Surratt ended up having the biggest game. And then had the run back with Caden Robinson of Appy State. He was like 4% owned.
Yeah, I had a good healthy amount of the App State side, and that actually worked out a lot better with them being lower owned, and their quarterback a way better game than McLeod did, and kind of wish I hadn't game stacked it as much as I did because it was a pretty low overall total. But the lineups that were just App State lineups actually did pretty well.
Yeah, he saved me from it. Looked like I was going to have a bad slate, but obviously Gordon having the big one, and then like Robinson being sub 10%, which was a nice surprise, worked out quite well. All right, we're going to jump right into the slate here. Again, we are talking about the 10-game Friday slate. The happy Thanksgiving to everyone who does celebrate that. We moved the show up one day because, you know, in the past I've done the Thanksgiving show, but we're hosting this year, so just no opportunity for me to do that. And doing this allows me to also have Jake on here, so I don't have to handle the entire thing by myself. So we do appreciate that. I will have content for the Saturday slate as well, and there'll still be the Q&A Saturday morning for that stuff, so we'll be able to catch up and still do that. But just wanted to harp on it that this is going to be the Friday 10-game slate on DraftKings. All right, so we're going to get into it here immediately. A nice little slate, I think. There's a good mixture of game types and a myriad of options and a good amount of running backs that I like as well, which is always a good thing for us. But Jake's going to kick us off first game here, Miami versus BC. Miami 10-point favorites, a total of 48. I do feel like maybe that total over could be in play, but you know, Miami, they're kind of have these weird games where like, yeah, they explode and have these, you know, shootouts. And then they have games where their defense looks really good. So what are we expecting from these two teams here on Friday?
Yeah, man. Like you said, Miami, every time you think you've got Miami figured out and you're like, okay, I know how this game flow is going to work out. Nope, you're wrong. It's just, that ain't it. And so they are a difficult team to kind of project. 10-point favorites in this one, and you know, playing on the road in what isn't really like a hyped rivalry game. Like, you know, Miami Florida State was like that's their big game. And I don't know what now, right? So I could very much see this being a game that Miami comes out a little bit flat in, just because there's not a whole lot of hype to it. There's not a lot, you know, emotionally that they're playing for. They're playing on the road. It's a very early game, the day after Thanksgiving. Some tryptophan might enter the bloodstream a little bit. I'm not super excited about, you know, a lot of the guy. Definitely not Tyler Van Dyke. Like, I would take all that circumstance out of it. It's Tyler Van Dyke at 7.4 is not interesting anyway. That doesn't mean you can't use a receiver. There are some decent options. I mean, Restrepo, not game of his life because he is good, but just absolutely amazing game against Louisville. You know, ton of volume, 8 catches for 193 yards. It's ridiculous average. And it's not like he had like a 75-yard catch boosting that. His longest catch went for only 48 yards. Did score a touchdown on that one, put up, you know, the huge game in the loss against Louisville. It's an interesting way to go. I'm not super bullish on the Restrepo play. Don't necessarily think that he's going to come out guns blazing. Passing game is somewhat diverse, even though he does get his fair share of targets. At 6.6, it is a good price. It's not a screaming deal. If he were in the 5s for some reason, I would be like, okay, yes, we do have to go pretty lock button on Restrepo. It is kind of an above average play and the one I'm probably most interested in. BC is one of those scenarios where teams haven't really had to throw on them because they've been winning by so much that they're not, you know, hitting ceilings on passing yards. And that there may be some of that here, but I think this game stays more competitive, even than the line would indicate. And so I think it'll be a pretty normal flow of offense throughout from Miami. I don't think they're going to take the foot off the gas or anything. It's just, you know, whether we think that that's going to be through Restrepo only or through a variety of pass catchers. So, you know, you can also consider Colby Young. I know we've been on him earlier in the season. Jacoby George has had, you know, had a blow up game against Florida State, and hasn't had anything remotely like that since. And that was also a game that Restrepo missed. And so I think that's probably the main focus on the Miami side is going to be Restrepo, but not necessarily someone I am going to force in anywhere. As far as the running game, far too diversified. We might even have a Jay Allen back for this one. So that's a 4-headed running back committee that I want no part of. And we're not even really getting a discount on any of those guys for the volume. I mean, Fletcher has seen double-digit carries in each of the last 3 weeks, but at 6,700, there's, I think, a lot of guys that are guaranteed more touches and will be more involved in their respective offenses at far better prices. On the BC side, there's always an argument to be made using Thomas Castellanos. He's a cheap dual threat, and I don't even really want to refer to him as a dual threat. He's a single threat, but the threat is running, right? He's that kind of quarterback, and so that guy can break the slate in both ways. If he's extremely popular, which I don't think he will be on this slate, but if he's extremely popular and does poorly, you can start your lineups and your day off to a pretty rough start because he threw 2 picks and fumbled the ball twice and got sacked for 50 yards, and it's a mess all the way around. I do think that he has success here. Going with the narrative of Miami comes out pretty flat in this one. A real good way for a Russian quarterback to take advantage of a defense that comes out flat is to just kind of run all over them and have them be unprepared for that. So I think there's definitely an argument to using Castellanos. I'm a little bit more hyped to use Kai Robichaud, former Hilltopper. Got a shout out anytime there's any connection to Western Kentucky. 5.5 for a guy that's gotten 20 plus, closer to 25 carries in each of the last 3 games that he's played in. It's a heck of a lot of volume, and we've said Miami's unpredictable. What if the unpredictable thing they do this time is just get completely taken advantage of on the ground game? Sell out to, maybe stop the run, put a spy on Castellanos, and it kind of messes with their defensive scheme and opens up some lanes for Kai Robichaud. It's not the craziest thing in the world, and 5.5 at a lot of volume, actually pretty interested in that. They, with Robichaud having missed some games recently, they had been using Alex Broom, not at anywhere near the same kind of volume. I think he's topped out at 15 carries, the most he's had in one all season, but Robichaud has definitely been the man when he is healthy, and I think there's a lot of merit to using him. Definitely in GPP, could probably also consider him, if not, be aggressively considering him for a main lineup. I do like that play quite a bit. I don't like anybody on the BC in the BC pass catching group. I think that kind of goes without saying. Castellanos is very much a run first, if not run only quarterback. And therefore you do not want to use any of his pass catchers. So either of Castellanos or Robichaud from the BC side, and then mainly just Restrepo from the Miami side for me.
Yeah, I've been when I was looking at this one, that price of Castellanos at 6K, I feel like we've seen cheap quarterbacks, especially ones that can run, be pretty chalky. Curious to see where he lands here. As of now, I think it's probably on the lower side, but I do wonder as people start making lineups, so they decide, a lot of people are just hell bent on 2 quarterbacks. If that's the case, we may actually see a pocket of 15 to 20% ownership on him. But I would agree, his receivers are pretty tough to get behind. The best and most talented that he has are out for the year. The only one you could use would be Lewis Bond at 4K, but that's a pretty big desperation play, I think. So I'd be inclined to agree. And the running back group, totally a mess, like you mentioned. I would love to see people pay 7K for Fletcher. He had a big game in their last one, but that just feels like such a bad play because it could definitely be Chaney or even Parrish breaking out again. So I'm in agreement. I think it's Castellanos or nothing for me in that one. All right, moving on to a game.
No Robichaud exposure for you?
No, I don't think so. I might be respecting Miami a little bit too much. The volume's great. I mean, he's only 5'5", and I don't think that he will carry any much ownership, at least initially. Last time he was on a slate, like what was he? Almost 7K at one point, I think. So yeah, he's a great price for somebody getting 20 plus carry. So I suppose, yeah, I should say if I'm running any alts, I don't know if I'm actually going to have more than like one or two lineups this time. But yeah, I can't completely ignore somebody getting 24 or 25 touches on that kind of salary.
Just think it's one of those, if Miami does come out flat, like let's say we're right about that, they're going to be pounded in the ground game, and it's going to be Castellanos or Robichaud, and I feel like the industry is going to trend toward being on Castellanos just because of the cheap QB thing. So it seems like it's a narrow play, but I feel like it's a pretty good leverage spot. And maybe I'm just crazy, but I like it.
Because their offense is, we've seen it in a couple of recent games, especially that Syracuse game. Like it's just those two guys, and they feel comfortable just running the entire time, like a straight up service academy type of offense with a little bit more juice. So I definitely can see it. We'll see how we go with these other running backs because there are some good ones, but he's definitely on the in play there. All right, next game we're going to talk about is TCU versus Oklahoma. This one carries one of the highest totals on the slate at 63.5. The Sooners 10.5 point favorites. This is one that I feel like we're going to see a lot of ownership on the Oklahoma side. We have to obviously be aware Gabriel nicked up. I don't think he's in any real danger of missing this matchup. I think unless he goes into warmups and has a setback or he's just really not doing too well. He's went from the first month of the season being relatively unknown by the masses to just being super chalky each and every week. That injury might keep his numbers down a little bit. It is 9.3, so it's a little bit of a high number. What I think ends up happening is people end up just playing our guys Kevin Sawchuk, who's now trending towards being chalky. But I do always like Dylan Gabriel in GBPs, but obviously this upper body injury, whatever it's going to amount to, is just makes me a little bit nervous about the 9.3 price point. I do think they'll end up running the ball a little bit because TCU's defense, while it's been good at times this year, it's nowhere near an elite tier. So you do have Gabriel there, big time play. He can run. He didn't end up doing it last week because once he got a little bit beat up, they kind of backed off. But he's fully capable of throwing for 400 yards, multiple touchdowns. We know that. Speaking of Sawchuk, he's there at 5.5. So again, you have even more leverage if you go to Robichaud, because at this price point, I think the masses do go with Sawchuk because of the fact that he is getting, a pretty sizable workload. He has rushed for over 100 yards in 3 straight games, scored a touchdown in 4 of his last 5. He's playing very, very well. He kind of shook off those, he had that really rough start for us where he, dropped a pass, fumbled, hit for a loss. And he's really overcome that. He did have a fumble against BYU, but it was just kind of a dinky little play. It didn't really cost him anything. And he's just been really super consistent. I could see him getting somewhere, between 20 to 25 touches, whether that's actual carries or a combination of receptions. I'm now feeling pretty confident in him. I know the Oklahoma backfield's been somewhat of a mystery throughout, but Major's still not looking like he's going to play with that shoulder issue. I'd be surprised if he played again this season. Walker, his workload has just gone from, 15 to 23, but then to 8, 1, 5. Like he's just, all over the place with his carries. And then Joe Barnes has just not been healthy enough to really been able to play either. And when he did get in, he was just way too limited.
Didn't they come out and say that Walker wasn't going to play last game, and then he played like
5
or something? That was wild.
There, I don't know what that was about, but yeah, that they had said that it was going to be all Sawchuk, and he didn't get the huge workload that you would have thought. But
no, he didn't really matter. But it was like, okay, sure,
yeah. So I guess I should put the caveat that what I'm hearing is Major is probably not going to play again this year, but beware that they may just throw him onto the field and give him carries on Friday anyways. You just don't know with these guys. But right now it does look like Sawchuk's going to be relatively highly owned. At least I think he will be at that price point in this matchup. So be aware of that. Receivers wise, they've been banged up there as well. Now Farouk is expected to play, but it carries a true questionable tag. We'll see what happens there. He hasn't really been that great this year anyways. When we thought he would take this opportunity with Andrell out to kind of burst out, it really didn't happen. It's been just so much Drake Stoops, and then the obligatory, weekly, Nick Anderson big play that he's normally good for. And he did only had 12 yards last week, but one of them was a touchdown. So you have a couple of options here on the Oklahoma side. Stoops leading the team in targets with 82, has 765 yards, 9 touchdowns, 66 receptions. I just did not see that season coming from him. Granted, Andrew Anthony played just 6 games before bowing out to injuries, but I still would never have saw that from Stoops. He's been very, very good. Anderson up to 44 targets, 27 catches, 628 yards, 9 touchdowns. Again, just a big play threat. I think he's probably more in the GPP realm just because with Gabriel, I do worry that they're not going to end up throwing it quite as much. It would behoove them to run a little bit more too and maybe keep that TCU offense, which has been pretty fun lately, off the field as much as possible. But when it does come to the wide receivers, 5-3 for Nick Anderson, that is obviously an agreeable price, more so than the 6-1 of Drake Stoops. So we'll probably still see a little bit on Anderson, but I do personally feel like he's a little bit more of a GPP play. However, he is so cheap and I like to pay down at receivers. If I found myself in that range on my last spot, I wouldn't mind just going to it. It's not like, oh, hell no, I won't play him. He's just not a priority for me. And that may end up being opposite than a lot of people. On the TCU side, I'm a real big fan of this Josh Hoover kid. I don't know that I'll actually get there in my main, but at 7-3, and Chandler Morris did get some action. Would he throw 4 passes, completed 2 of them? So I don't know if there is going to be a situation where they play both of them. I think it would be smart to continue to roll with Hoover just because he has played really, really well. 4 of his last 5 games, he's thrown over 300 yards, has shown a really good mastership of this offense, already developed with these receivers even better than I think Morris has. He does have a little teeny bit of rushing upside, not as much as Morris, but he's just a really good passer. But I would hate for this to turn into a situation like a MAC team where you had all those multiple quarterbacks where Hoover's out there throwing passes and then Morris is coming in and, kiping gold line work or something crazy like that. So I don't know that will happen, but it is enough to obviously keep us away from using them, I think, in the main lineup, because if you use Hoover and then Morris comes in halfway through, it would just be a disaster. Instead, we can look to a guy like perhaps Imani Bailey, who is a little bit on the high side at 6'9", I think. We're not seeing the big yardage games out of him, but he is a touchdown machine. I was kicking myself last week because I had a prop parlay that almost all the way hit except for his, and I kept going back and forth between the anytime touchdown and 100 yards, and I went the yardage, which obviously didn't work out, and he scored twice, so kind of kicked myself there. But he has nice touchdown equity in this offense, regardless of who's going to be in there at quarterback. He'll get a sizable workload. And score. But at 7K, you want obviously to see a little bit more, century yardage marks there for a guy that you might be paying that price for. The wide receivers for TCU, it's a bit of a mystery at times. We're seeing a good amount of Jared Wiley, 7, 178 and 2 against Baylor. Baylor's just a really down year for them. Everybody beats up on them. But even before that, Wiley's been turning in some pretty solid performances with Hoover, 6 for 65, 4 for 64. And I know those don't sound great, but at the time he was only 3.8 when he was doing those. The huge game has now brought his price to 5.7, which I think is probably a back off point. But if you want a GPP look in this game, or perhaps you're stacking it, Wiley is looking like he's Hoover's number 1 option. He really, really does like throwing him the football. Initially, he was all about J.P. Richardson earlier on when he first took the reins. Hasn't been the case as much now. He's been still getting targeted, but just been kind of the WR2, WR3. And then you have these, secondary receivers who are cheap, the JoJo Earls of the world, Savion Williams, all these guys capable of catching touchdowns. Williams in week 11 against Texas, 11, 164 and 1. So these guys all have GPP upside, but none of them are really main team viable because they could easily turn in a 2 for 20 while the next guy goes off. You might even see a game where Jack Beck, catches 2 touchdowns randomly. Unlikely, but you never know with TCU. So with this game being the highest total, usually what everybody does, well, I got to stack it up. But I just look at it and I see obvious chalk with Sawchuck, perhaps some ownership on Anderson, and then on the TCU side, a lot of GPP stuff for me, because there's just a lot of uncertainty with the usage, the targets, and the actual scoring when it comes to the receivers. You can play Amani Bailey, but I'm not crazy about his price. So usually I give you the Oklahoma games, wanted to switch it up, but I do want your take on, hey, if Dylan Gabriel's banged up here, are you kind of falling in line with Sawchuk too, or what are you doing here?
I am, man. I think obviously Dylan Gabriel wants to tough it out and solidify his toughness and his season. But I mean, he didn't come back in the second half of that game. Like there's something wrong with the guy. Like he's going to be playing, but he's going to be playing through an injury, and that's going to sap efficiency. That's going to affect play calling. Like they're going to probably figure out he's maybe not like this either the same level of mobile or able to get the ball down the field. Like there's going to be something that he's not capable of doing in the same way that he typically does. And so I do think that trends to Sawchuk. I think that's going to be the obvious beneficiary. And yeah, man, Drake Stoops, whew, heck of a season from Drake Stoops. Did not see that become, it's not just like underneath passes either. Like Drake Stoops is catching 20-yard post routes, and I don't know how that happened, but I don't necessarily know that I'm going to get there because of the way I feel about Gabriel. And that I think this could be a more kind of run heavy game plan for Oklahoma. But the upside is always there with that passing game if he's 100% healthy, which I don't think he is.
For sure. And sometimes Oklahoma they're a little bit unavoidable sometimes with their injury reporting, and I guess it's hard to trust them because they do things that they say they're not going to do, or the complete opposite. So I don't know what to expect, but yeah, I think playing Sawchuk in that first game and just kind of going from there is a pretty safe bet, I think. All right, moving to the next game here. I don't know how we continue. They throw these Iowa games at us. Iowa and Nebraska. Nebraska saw 2.5-point favorites. Now the total, I just like every week I don't imagine it'll get lower, like 33, then it's 31, then it's 30, 29. But DK right now has a total of, I had to double check it because I thought it was wrong, 26 points. That's pretty damn low.
Yeah, I see 25.5 in a couple places right now. Like that's an insane, like that is actually the literal lowest total ever in the history of college football. Which takes the record from Iowa from like 4 weeks ago against Rutgers or whenever that was. So yeah, man, Iowa's got a brand. And I'm a little bit bummed too, because I want to play Chuba Purdy so bad. Like I obviously am not in this spot. He is only 6K, but not in this spot against Iowa. Like that's a mistake. That's a wrong thing to do. He will fumble the ball a few times. He'll throw some picks. He'll get sacked a lot. Like you don't want to play Chuba Purdy in this game. But in future Nebraska games, you absolutely do. Like he like could have been the guy at he was at Florida State, right? Like he could have been the guy there if there wasn't Jordan Travis waiting in the wings. And he's not a Jeff Sims. Like he can actually throw the ball. He just happens to be pretty mobile too. And I do look forward to playing him in the future. Sorry, I have to talk about something for this game. So I'm just going to talk about Chuba Purdy for a while. Shout out to the Purdy family in general.
Florida State would love to have him right now, by the way.
Yeah. Maybe he could get like one of those crazy eligibility waivers to just go back for a bowl game or something. You can't play anybody from this game. It's a 25.5 total. Like that's all there is to it. We can pretty easily move on. Like they're even the one thing you could kind of sort of maybe do with Iowa is like play a high volume running back, just because they'll have the ball a lot and eventually might wear down the other team in the trenches. But now they're splitting carries. So it's like the one useful thing Iowa had We can't even do that because there's splitting carries between Caleb and LaShawn. So we can just skip to the next game. There's nothing here for this. If somehow DK lets you play the Iowa defense in the Superflex, I'm all in, but they haven't done that yet.
Yeah, and that we've had to sacrifice, not this week because it's a pretty set schedule, but there's been some games we didn't have on the slate, and instead we had Iowa, and it's just like I know they try to do the ranked thing, but just come on, man. Like, don't put these games on the slate.
They could have just taken this one off and put the Egg Bowl in and included that in the slate. That would have been the move. That would have been very exciting, but
Yeah.
Can't do that, unfortunately. And, leaves us with a wonderful 25.5 total to talk about.
That would have been actually awesome because I remember last year talking to a couple people that do NFL and those slates that have like the Monday, Thursday games. Like people tend to like stack those games even if they're trash. So that gives you a pretty big edge. So I think that would have been a pretty cool element. They should have definitely thought of something like that. All right, moving on. Memphis versus Temple. I have a 13-point favorite for Memphis, the total of 64. So this one does look like the highest total on this particular slate. This should also draw heavy consideration. Now, the Oklahoma TCU game, we expect points, but I'm kind of like, Sawchuck, okay, a couple guys, but with this Memphis Temple game, and we don't get Memphis on the slate as much, but when we do, I feel like I want everybody. We start with Seth Hennigan, who's there at 8.8. It's a relatively high price, I think, considering where I usually like to pay for quarterback, at least the one that I use. But he's obviously in a great spot here against the Temple team that's going to be totally overmatched. You look at Hennigan's attempts against SMU, 51, Charlotte, 48, USF, 40. Had a couple 28s in there, but a high volume attack. And he's had several other games earlier in the year, 43 against Tulane, 47 against Missouri. He has been just winging it. And the last 4 games, he's clipped 300 yards. So he's certainly worth the price here. Even if it blows out, I think we're still looking at 30 to 35 attempts. He does have minor rushing upside. I don't think it's a fact of like he doesn't have it. He just doesn't have to do it as often, but he certainly can score a rushing touchdown or even get up, 35, 45, 60 rushing yards if it comes down to it. This year, he's been really good, 24 touchdowns to 8 interceptions, over 3,200 passing yards, 250 rushing yards, and 4 touchdowns. So the 8.8 price point is certainly good. You can get there. And this is a spot where you could definitely use him. People always ask like quarterback, running back. You can certainly do that. Blake Watson at 7.3. That's probably a little bit underpriced for where he should be. He's had some massive, massive games this year, and he's clearly, the number one option there. We have some really talented backs like Sutton Smith, Brandon Thomas, who we thought would be the heir apparent a couple of years ago. And Blake Watson at 7.3, it really seems like a misprice. He's kind of trending towards a top 2 running back pre-slate for me. And I do expect him to be relatively high owned. You might look at it and see, 83 yards on 22 carries, not great. 41 on 10, not great. 64 on 10. I mean, that's a good YPC, but you want to see more yardage. But he just scores touchdowns every week. Like his anytime touchdown prop is usually like as high as Quinshawn Judkins, like minus 500, minus 700, because he's just going to score a touchdown regardless. We want to see some of that yardage, but the nice thing about Blake is he catches a ton of passes. Targets wise, he's 3rd on the team with 51, 46 receptions, 422 yards, 2 touchdowns. So even if he only rushes for 60, 70 yards, he's probably scoring twice, and then he's going to give us that PPR work, 5 to 6 receptions, 25 to 50 yards, maybe a touchdown there. So he's just so safe. And this Temple team is they've actually got some pretty interesting options offensively, but their defense is just completely overmatched against this Memphis team. They're giving up over 35 points a game to their opponents, about 250 yards through the air, and almost 200 yards on the ground to their opponents, about 450 yards of total offense. And there's been a lot where they've given up more than that. So great spot to look at these Memphis guys. Those are the 2 obvious plays there with Watson and Hennigan. And yes, you can play them together if you want. Receivers wise, Rock Taylor, I miss, their Blankensee and Taylor. There were times earlier this year they were below 6K and low 5K, and now they're priced up because they've just been so good. And Rock Taylor's had a phenomenal season, almost to 100 targets at 87 right now, 57 catches, 925 yards, 4 touchdowns. So he's about to throw down 1,000-yard season. Demir Blankensee, 77 targets, 50 catches, 778 yards, 6 touchdowns. So those are the top 2 guys. We see some random pop-up games from guys like Joseph Skates, Kobe Drake, Towski Dove is over there, but mainly it's the top 2 of Rock Taylor and Demir that have kind of separated themselves from the pack. I do like GPP shots at guys like Skates because he has been good earlier in the season for like a 2-catch game, but one of them being a touchdown. He had a nice little 3 out of 4 games touchdown streak going earlier this year. He's only 4.3, so if you're paying up for certain spots and you can't get a premier Memphis receiver, you can definitely consider using Skates or perhaps even, Drake, who's kind of just a buy low 3.9 guy that's going to get you probably 7 to 10 points at most. But just getting exposure to this game, because you never know. I mean, it's Temple. If Drake gets, one open and there's a, guy slips or something and he's gone, like, shoot, you got a 70-yard touchdown at 3.9, you're feeling pretty good about yourself. And same thing with Towski Dove, who has been pretty active the last couple of games and seen his targets increase. No guarantee that continues, but anytime your quarterback's throwing 50 passes, that is a lot of work to go around for several different options. So I would prioritize Rock Taylor. I know it's not very imaginative. He's the most expensive on the slate there for Memphis, but 6.3 still a very reasonable price. I like him over Blankensee. Blankensee, we usually see him be super chalky when he's on the slate because he was a lower price earlier this year. Now he does have a lower floor, but the last 4 games he's just been super automatic. And opponents-wise, Charlotte, USF, SMU, it's not seeing like murderous defenses, but he's also going to match up with Temple where he's seeing an even worse defense than that. So he could very well continue these 25, 30 fantasy point game streak that he's on. Almost want to just play 3 Memphis guys, prioritize that, and then try to stuff in as many, running backs as possible. And we have a couple of other options. Our guy Schrader's on the slate. Boone from Toledo, we get some more action here. So there's some really nice looks at running back, but I definitely think we want to prioritize these Memphis guys. The Temple side as well, like Memphis defense is not some world beater either. They give up points, and they are a relatively fantasy-friendly defense in their own right, giving up almost 30 points a game as well. Right around 171 yards per game to running backs and right around 245 yards per game to quarterbacks. So there is a chance for Temple. It's a high total for a reason, right? And there's a good chance for Temple to certainly put some points on the board here. It's probably taking one of their cheap wide receivers. I don't know that at the quarterback spot. It is EJ Warner. He's 6'5", so you have a relatively cheap quarterback who's going to get a nice little bit of volume. He has thrown 40-plus passes in 4 of his last 5. He had a game against UTSA where he threw 65 times. A lot of volume, 472 yards, 5 touchdowns. So at 6'5", he's definitely a solid look here against this Memphis team, and he's going to give you a relatively high floor because of it. Doesn't offer much in terms of any rushing ability, but again, this is just like super crazy volume that he's throwing, and it's a pretty good bet that he's going to hit somewhere between 40 to 45 attempts here in this game. At 6'5", he puts up 350, 3 touchdowns. You're going to be feeling pretty good about yourself. So this is a slate where I could see going for running backs, but also there is cheapies at the quarterback spot that we can use and get away with, being able to stretch out our salary a little bit more. So he's certainly in play there. The Temple running backs, they do have a bit of a committee, like a half committee thing going on. So not really interested. They're all cheap. Joe Quest Smith, he's going to get, about 15 to 20% of the snaps. Then you have Darvon Hubbard, who is generally looked at as kind of the RB1 at times. And then you have Edward Sadie, who it seemed like he was left for dead earlier in the year, and now he's starting to get a little bit more work, especially as a receiver. He's only 3.5. He does have 17 receptions for 170 yards, 6 of which have come in the last 3 games. So he's certainly a guy to look at for GPP, value there at 3.5, but the Temple running backs are very low end, even though the matchup's good. And the reason I think that you have to look at them for GPPs is because I think one of them will score. I just can't tell you with certainty if it's going to be Hubbard, Sadie, or Smith. And whichever one you take, inevitably you're going to watch the other two score. So just kind of be aware of that if you consider them for your main builds. The wide receivers for Temple, there are some decent talent here. Dante Wright leads the team in targets with 68, 34 catches, 485 yards, and 4 touchdowns. He has been a premium benefactor. He had 12 targets in their last game. He's had over 20 in their past 3. He, of course, played 4 years at Colorado State, where he was a relatively productive receiver for them. Zay Baines, second on the team, with 62 targets, 32 catches, 400 yards, and a touchdown. David Martin Robinson, who's their tight end, 38 catches on 55 targets for 500 yards, 4 touchdowns. And then Ahmad Anderson, who played many years ago for Purdue, 53 targets, 30 catches, 478 yards, and a touchdown. Their second tight end has also been targeted heavily, especially recently. Jordan Smith, 51 targets, 23 catches, 250 yards, and 4 touchdowns. So it's a pretty widespread receiving room, but there are options because of all the volume going around. Like a guy like Jordan Smith, who really kind of been their tight end too. Like, he's only 3'8". You look at what he's been doing. He's been super efficient with the looks that he has gotten. In his past 5 games, he scored 4 touchdowns. A lot of touchdown equity in the red zone, and a guy that Warner looks at a lot there. He's the 5 for 50 special, but he's only 3'8", and there is a touchdown potential there for him. I think Dante Wright at 4K, if any Temple guy would end up chalky, I think it would be him. He's coming off the 6 for 146 in one game, 30 fantasy points against UAB. Only 4K, heavily targeted. He doesn't have the greatest catch rate in the world. A lot of his targets they're just not very good looks. So he's not going to put up these super consistent games, but when he does connect, it's usually a big play. But there's a chance for like a 1 for 13 there with him. But expect him to be highly, highly owned, I think, when this game is, people kind of go through the totals and do their thing. Ahmad Anderson, he did not play against UAB. They are calling that some kind of disciplinary action, or I don't really know. But if at 3.9, if he's back on the field, he's also a very good option. He was their WR1 for the first 4 or 5 weeks of the season. Wright was also kind of banged up at that point, and they've kind of swapped roles now. So Anderson is worth looking at for GPPs at only 3.9. And then Martin Robinson, who does operate as the kind of tight end one or the primary option there at the tight end. Usually they do run a little bit of two tight end sets. He's 4.5, the most expensive on the slate, 14 plus fantasy points in 3 straight, and he's just been really solid. So any of those guys I'm fine with. I kind of, look at tight ends a little bit more than most. I think the Smith kid at 3.8 is just such a good leverage spot off the other two, who like I said, I'm projecting Wright to be the highest owned of this group. But very easily Smith could be the one to catch 2 touchdowns. And if Wright has one of his 1 for 13 games, you're just going to be so far above the field. I just don't see him having a ton of ownership. And if anything, people would be looking to Martin Robinson instead, or even Zay Baines, who is only min price 3K. Baines hasn't had the consistency of some of the others, but he did have a game against Navy back in week 10, 7 catches, 132 yards, 23 fantasy points. So, min price Zay Baines will probably see a spike of ownership on him as well. This is a very easy game stack to get to, unlike the TCU Oklahoma game for me, because guys are priced so low, and we have a really good sense of where the production is going to come from on both sides, at least at the receiver spots for both teams, and definitely for the running back spot for Memphis. So it's basically just a question of how many pieces do you want. The full game stacks haven't been as great, I've noticed this year for CFB, so I don't necessarily want to just be like 5 deep. But I think 3 is probably a must, and if you end up with a 4th, I don't think it'll hurt you by any means having it in this game. Probably going 70 plus for those looking for bets out there. Over 64 is certainly in play. So, what kind of prioritization do you have on the various options in a game like this? Because there's a lot of good ones.
Yeah, man. I guess I'm pretty boring. Dante Wright at 4K. Like, I don't want to get too fancy. That's a pretty attractive price. And yes, volume, but also explosiveness, which is something that I look for. at a reduced price point, and they probably are going to be slinging it a good amount, because the defense just hasn't been able to get it done, and Memphis is attackable as well. So yeah, I really do like both, like a Blake Watson paired with a Dante Wright. Probably a super choppy thing to do, but if I get weird enough elsewhere, which I always plan to, I think that's a really solid start to the build.
Definitely. All right, next game we're going to talk about, we're getting into the MACtion portion of the show. I know you're excited for that. Ohio versus Akron. Ohio 14-point favorites, total 41, fairly low, not Iowa low, but definitely on the low side. You had a chance, like I said, to dive into the MAC and break that down. And I know it's always one that, conference you're looking forward to each year. So give us the full breakdown of Ohio Akron, how many quarterbacks we have available to us, and who the best options are in this one.
Yeah, man. So we started the year talking about a severely underpriced, at least we thought at the time, Curtis Rourke. He was like $5K or something. And he was coming off an injury. We weren't sure if he was going to be any good. Wasn't sure if he was going to run the ball as much. He's been pretty terrible. Terrible is too strong a word. He's been below average to lukewarm, I guess. Not a dude I'm super excited about playing, which is a shame. I thought he was going to be a lot better than he's been this season, especially when it came to conference play. Thought that he was going to be able to turn things up a notch, and it's just, pretty much outside of the Kent State game, that was the only game where he really went off, and if you follow MACtion, everybody kind of tends to go off against Kent State. So it's not even really a feather in his cap. It's just basically getting the job done. Every other game, it's been just mediocre game after mediocre game. Did, I guess, pop off a little bit too against Bowling Green, but definitely not somebody I'm looking to pay 7.2 for. They do pretty much tend to stick to just him. So at least, if you are looking in that direction, you don't have to worry about the 2 quarterback thing. And he also does call his own number at the goal line to a degree. Let's see, how many rushing touchdowns on the season? Only 3 rushing touchdowns on the season. That's another part of the disappointment. We probably thought he was going to do a little bit more of that, potentially playing through some injury. I don't know. But yeah, just overall, not a dude I'm jumping out of my chair to use at any price, but especially at 7.2. I think we can do a lot better than that. We had talked in the past about, O'Shawn Allison being back this year, and that, eating into the workload of Saye Bangura, which was true to a degree, still is true to a degree, but I don't think it's to the degree that we expected it to be. Having seen what we'd seen in the past from O'Shawn Allison, kind of thought he had the chance to maybe be the dude, and it's not that. It's very much like a 80-20 split, with Bangura getting the lion's share of the work right now. Bangura at 6'5" against Akron is a priority play for me. I'm very into that. Game flow wise, two touchdown favorites, that plays right into the hand of it being a lot of Bangura happening. I think that's just the way they're going to want to see the game flow work is running the ball, pounding the ball, controlling clock, and not making Rourke have to do a whole heck of a lot. So probably going to be a lot of Bangura. If you want to get fancy and sprinkle in an O'Shawn Allison, I don't hate it. I do think he probably sees a little bit more work in this one than he has, just because I think Ohio probably gets out to even a little bit bigger lead than that spread would indicate, and could see some not quite blowout but comfortable lead type of run where you're like, hey, we don't necessarily need to put 30 carries on Bangura today, and so we might see a 18 carries for Bangura and 12 instead of 25 and 5, the way that it's broke down recently. But I also think that all of the carries, regardless of who is taking them, are going to be super efficient. So even a slightly reduced workload for Bangura, I'm still interested in him at that price. And I'm also not going to shy away from an Allison GPP type of play. In the passing game, Sam Wiglusz was supposed to be the dude, kind of in the same vein that Rourke has disappointed. Wiglusz is not as disappointing, but still a disappointing season, relative to what the expectation was for Wiglusz. He's really only had that first game against SDSU. I mean, that was the Sam Wiglusz game that we were expecting, right? Like 10 catches for 103 yards, didn't get in the end zone, but that's fine. There's some variance to that, but only 3 touchdowns so far in the season, has only caught 10 passes one other time. This season, it's not like he's been close. It's not he's been like 7, 9. It's been 3s and 5s and 4s. It's like just not something's not right with that Ohio offense, whether it's Rourke himself or the game plan or play calling, whatever the case may be. They are not, even though they're winning games, they're not as explosive and dominant as we kind of would have hoped they would have been, with as many people returning as they have. Miles Cross, again, there's probably more upside there because he's going to end up being a deep threat on occasion, but only really the one spike game against guess who, Kent State. Hard to get to him. Hard to get to either him or Wiglusz, frankly, in the 5K range. Not super excited about that. Believe it or not, I'm actually more excited about plays on the Akron side, which is a weird thing to say. Lorenzo Lingard has had a ton of volume this season. 137 carries on the season, and had 26 carries in their most recent game, and has had at least 1 catch in every game this season, and that workload has been on an uptick of late. 5 catches and 4 catches in the last 2 games, in addition to 20 plus carry workloads in 2 of his last 3. It's a weird spot to use a running back, 14-point dogs against an offense that is going to look to control clock. You wouldn't necessarily think like, hey, I really want to use the running back on the other side of that, right? But this is going to be like a do everything guy. This isn't like a, put him in on 1st and 2nd down and he's coming out on 3rd down because he can't pass block kind of guy. Like Lorenzo Lingard will be involved in whatever this offense is able to do. And I skipped over quarterback for the Akron side. Not that you are going to play Jeff Undercuffler Jr., but it is the MAC, and we do have names like this that come up. Where would you rank Undercuffler on the MAC Hippenhammer scale of Maction names?
It's not Hippenhammer is like the truly elite name. Undercuffler kind of like maybe like at a 1 of 10 is like a 7. It's pretty close. It's
good. Like it's not elite, but it's it's worthy of consideration, right? But Akron does the 2 quarterback thing. They'll bring in Taj Bullock for like in the article I was calling it the Taysom Hill things. So they'll bring in Taj Bullock to do the Taysom Hill things, which doesn't mean you play Taj Bullock by any means, but it takes just enough from Undercuffler that even at 5'2", not a guy that you want to consider. He's had over 10 fantasy points exactly once this season, so can safely avoid the Undercuffler, even though very fun name to say. What it doesn't mean is that you completely ignore his receivers. They do have a pretty condensed pass catching group, led by Josiah Gathings. 7 plus catches in each of his last 3 games, even with terrible quarterback play, in a scenario where you're going to be chasing points. Probably don't expect a ton of efficiency, but that many catches, you're racking up the PPR points, and he did actually get over 100 yards and scored a touchdown. That game was against Kent State, which you'll see is a theme in the MAC, but He put up solid numbers even when they got shut out against Miami of Ohio, 7 for 69, followed that up for 7 catches for 80 yards against DMU. So don't hate the Josiah Gathings play at all. I think it will be extremely low owned. I don't think a lot of people are going to play Akron players. I think they're just going to skip over that entirely. And there's enough receivers at that price point, especially with like everyone on Temple being that price point or less, that I don't think anybody's going to go there. And you could easily get him to a 880-1, right? And if all the Temple points somehow happen via the running game, weird. But if it happened, and you had Josiah Gathing sitting there at 880-1, which is a very reasonable outcome, you're lapping all those Temple lineups, right? And so a Bangura Gathings pairing from this game is probably the thing I'm most interested in. Give a little bit of a shout to Daniel George. He did have 5 catches for 83 yards in the past week and put up 9 for 104 and 1 in the Kent State game. So it's not like he doesn't exist, but I think Gathings for only 100 more is probably the play that I would prioritize. And they don't have a whole lot of other depth behind those two in terms of people that are reliable pass catchers. So I'm going to just stick to Lingard and Gathings on the Akron side, and then mainly just Bangura on the Ohio side.
Yeah, we were pretty clear early in the season that, hey, Allison's back, so temper expectations with Bangura because he was priced like he was still the only show in town in that first slate, and first couple of weeks that had to be the case, but he's really started to get more work and looking like the
price has come down while volume has gone up. So it's like, wow, that's exactly what you want to see if you're looking to use him. So I do like Bangura a good bit.
Yeah. And there's a bunch looking at this slate as we go there, like the Akron guys, the receiver that you just mentioned, Gathings and George, like there's so many sub 5K receivers on the slate. I can already start to tell like whoever hits on their cheap receivers is really going to nut hard. And it's going to be might be a high scoring slate because of all these underpriced receivers. Just throwing that out there. Cause I could certainly see Gathings outscore any of the Temple guys, like you said, or there's a couple of other cheapies we're going to get to here in a minute, but just keep that in mind when you're building. The receiver spot's going to be very, very important, more so than even usual. All right, next game on the slate is another MAC game, Toledo versus Central Michigan. This one is my computer just 54.5 total. Relatively high. I think we could see the over. Toledo is a team that I really like their quarterback. I like their running back. They've got a decent group of receivers, but Taquan Finn is somebody when this slate first came out, it looked like he's 8-3. I think people might, maybe use him to a degree, but I don't think he's going to be prioritized by anyone. He's got a few ugly games, in his logs, but he has been heating up recently, and I feel like he's in a really good spot, obviously, against this Central Michigan defense. They're giving up a ton of points, a ton of yardage, and there's a ton to like about this game for them. He has been throwing with decent volume. He does have rushing upside, doesn't have the most recently rushing yardage, but he does score. Early in the season he was racking it up, and you might look at it and not even realize that his rushing yardage total is up there around 500 or pretty damn close. 6 rushing touchdowns, 20 passing touchdowns to 8 interceptions, about 2,300 passing yards. So a real solid dual threat, but individually looking at it the last few weeks, people might be fooled because he hasn't really been able to do much on the ground, but he's definitely a threat to do so. And against this matchup especially, he can definitely break the slate. One of my favorite quarterbacks by far. Another spot where I'm okay doing the quarterback running back thing, Penny Boone for Toledo, playing about 70% of the snaps. Their RB2, who is generally Jackass Stewart, playing about 35%. He's stealing a bit of the work, but you can see like last game, he had 3 carries, but almost 15 fantasy points because he did catch a long touchdown. But generally, he's going to be around 12 to 15 touches. Not really looking to use him at a 6.4 price, but he does enough damage that kind of takes that like top end upside off of Boone. But Boone is just so vicious. 1,100 rushing yards. He's super efficient, has a YPC total season for almost 7.5, which is really impressive. 13 rushing touchdowns. He does have 12 receptions for almost 200 yards, a receiving score as well. But you see against Bowling Green, 15 carries only, but at 131 and a touchdown. The week before that, 11 carries only, but 3 touchdowns. 12 against Buffalo, but 125 yards. That may scare some people because usually when you're paying almost $8K for a running back, you really want that volume. But he's just been able to prove time and time again he doesn't need a ton of carries to explode. But when he does get them, he really nukes a slate. You go back and look at their matchup in week 4 against Western, 24 carries. He rushed for 211 yards on 20 totes. 22 carries against Ball State, 150 yards. So any kind of volume that Penny would get, he's just like such a fat lock to absolutely detonate and break the slate totally. And I really, really think people are going to look at it and be a little bit worried about the volume that he gets and this fact that Stewart looms there to take carries from him. But this matchup against Central Michigan is just very, very elite. So I'm looking at paying for Penny. I feel like this is my Audric estimate spot where he just, he's expensive. He wasn't highly owned. I feel like Boone's going to come in that same way and just kind of rock for us. So I'm really high on him. The receivers on the Toledo side, it's pretty balanced for the most part. Juwan Newton, 59 targets, Junior Vandeross, 52, and Larry Stevens, 34. Their tight end 1, Anthony Torres, has 27 targets. Most of them are between 270 and 500 yards. The touchdown leader is Newton with 9. Everybody else between 2 and 4. Don't have a lot of love for the Toledo receivers. I do find them to be a bit overpriced. Newton at 7-1, he's definitely capable of putting up big games, but there's just so many other cheap receivers on the slate who have done the same. Now, Newton had a very consistent stretch the first 2 months of the season. Toledo went through kind of a rough patch between week 7 and 9 before they blew up against Buffalo, where they were struggling offensively, and that really affected him. He hasn't really gotten going since. So the price needed to come down a little bit more for me to actually consider him. If there was a spot for him to kind of get back to his early season success, it's here against Central. Vandeross, the WR2, is only 5.5. He's certainly fine and looks okay there, but I just feel like if anything, we're playing Finn, we're playing Boone, and just continuing ride that offense, kind of like BC, but times a million, where the quarterback, running back handling most of the offensive work. That tends to be the case for this Toledo team as well. And they have other guys who, like Devin Maddox. I think it was 2 years ago. Devin Maddox was like a machine. Now he's really inconsistent, doesn't even matter or be a factor. He's 3.8. I think 2 years ago he's like 6K. The tight end, Torres, he's got some touchdown equity there, and is a guy who can give you 70 to 80 yards at 4.8. But again, there's a lot of sub 5K options that are a little bit better than that. I'd rather lean on the running side for Toledo. So Boone is kind of my separation play from what I think will be a separation play from the rest of the field. On Central, and the nice thing about Toledo, usually Finn's not going to have to worry too much about other quarterbacks. On the Central side, Jace Bauer, typically the only one throwing passes for them, but they do, now that Bert Emanuel is back after missing, half the season, back in there getting carries, 5 for 35 in week 12, 3 for 20 in week 11. That number will probably continue to go up. Emmanuel's a very versatile player, a very dangerous runner. He saw back in week 2 pre-injury, 21 carries for 101 yards. He's a very, very gifted dual threat. But he's probably more of a single threat, like you had mentioned on earlier. He doesn't really pass all that well when he is given the opportunities, mainly just out there to run. And it kind of is making them one-dimensional, because when he does come in, it's like, oh, there's that guy. They're gonna run the football. Like, he's not out there to throw. So it's enough to maybe make Bauer at 7-2 a lackluster option. We're not really looking at CMU quarterbacks anyways, but just be aware of there are 2 of them. Running backs wise, Marion Lukes, he's 7K. He's been really good. Matchup against Toledo, not fantastic. Certainly in play. He is one of those guys that is going to get, guaranteed volume, 15 to 20 minimum touches. He's maybe a little bit high at 7K. I foresee him being a guy that people kind of just write off, but it wouldn't surprise me if he ended up being a top 5 highest, scoring running back on the slate. Miles Bailey was the 1B to his 1A. He's kind of fallen back a little bit. After missing a couple of weeks with an ailment. He's only 5'1", but he is, getting 4 to 5 touches right now. Earlier, pre-missing games, he was getting more like 15. So it's enough to kind of turn me off of Luke's. But I like I said, GPP-wise, I think Luke's could actually be a very good option. And then the wide receivers for CMU, led by Jesse Pruitt with 50 targets, 30 catches, 432 yards, and 4 touchdowns. Tyson Davis, 39 targets, 25 catches, 404. And then you have Chris Parker, 22 catches on 42 targets for 403. Don't have a lot of love for the passing game or the receivers on either of these teams. I just want the running game. And like I said, really, let me see here if I can figure out. Yeah, so there's very few places that just spell out ownership or make projections or anything like that. So you kind of have to use your noggin and that, but it looks like sub 20% on Penny Boone. And there's a lot of great options at running back. So it's not as if he's some far and away the best, but I feel very confident that he's going to put up a big game here in this spot at relatively low ownership. So you're an action guy. Receivers, I really tried to find some receivers here that were not overpriced or at least worth it. But are you okay with Finn? Without an option, a lot of people are like, what quarterback, what wide receiver can I play with this quarterback? People have a hang up about running guys naked. Would you be perfectly fine running him naked because of his rushing upside, or do you find yourself wanting to get
absolutely? Absolutely. I mean, Finn, he is the show. I think it would be, probably detrimental to pair him with a receiver because the reason you're using him is getting those rushing touchdowns, right? And doesn't do you any good for your quarterback to get a rushing touchdown if you have a receiver. I also don't see him throwing a 70-yard bomb to someone where okay, well now you need that guy, right?
Yeah.
I just don't think the offense operates like that for them. So no problem using Finn naked. What's what I would prefer.
All right. Yeah, it's funny because it seems like that to you and I were like, yeah, that guy, we don't need a receiver, but still people are like, I gotta have a receiver, and you see it in lineups and stuff. But yeah, it's pretty clear that you don't need one. I mean, I guess his pairing partner is Penny Boone to me. All right, next game on the slate is Utah State versus New Mexico. I really like this game, actually. 6-point favorites of Utah State, a total of 60. Two defenses that should just fall all over themselves. Lots of fantasy goodness here. I think we want a chunk of ownership here on these guys. What are you seeing for this one?
Okay, so this is one we're going to have to watch a ton of injury news on, and it being one of the later games on the slate doesn't help. But first string, second string quarterbacks both hurt for Utah State. Maybe one of them will play, maybe both of them will play, maybe neither of them will play. Same is true for all of the first, second, and third string running backs for Utah State. I don't know what happened against Boise State, but they got beat up. The score was bad, 45-10 loss, but they just got super injured too. And those are just the skill position guys. They also have, linebackers and safeties that are missing. And this is a defense that wasn't good in the first place. So despite all that, New Mexico is a 6-point dog, and I want so much New Mexico money line. I'm not really a betting guy. That's not my thing on the show, especially, but I want so much New Mexico money line. That just stands out as this team just got their butt kicked and licking their wounds, and they still don't know if they're down to their third string quarterback and fourth string running back in terms of who's even available, and they're favored by a touchdown. That's just odd to me. My favorite play of the entire state. It's hard to talk about Utah State because we don't know who's healthy other than the receivers, obviously Mekhi Davis was one of the injured, one of the wounded that came out of that Boise State game, not feeling well. So we don't know if he's going to be able to go either. So if he's out, then the passing game gets condensed to both Royals and Vaughn, who at 64 and 68 ordinarily would stand out as extremely good plays. If you're down to a third string quarterback, I don't necessarily know that they're very good plays anymore. I think you have to probably take some pause, even with a condensed receiver room, that there's going to be a lack of efficiency and a drop off in the passing game there.
And it's real quick that the third string quarterback is Levi Williams, who we know can't throw the football very, very accurately, I should say.
Right. Yeah. So that could turn into a, Levi Williams decides to just run the ball a lot kind of game. And so really have to watch injury news on that one to know how to play the Utah State side. That is not the case with New Mexico. And maybe you're with me and maybe you're not, but Ja'Cory Krosky-Merritt is amazing. Like I want all of the Ja'Cory Krosky-Merritt, by far my favorite play on the slate at 6K. And I had a chance to watch the Fresno State game. Like, I don't get a lot into eye test. Like, I feel like that's a distraction and can cause bias, but my goodness, was he just like so explosive and the most fun player by far to watch in that game. And a game that also had Malik Sherrod, who I also like a lot. Krosky-Merritt is just like on another level against, it's mid-tier competition. Let's be honest. He's not playing against the Georgia defense, but Utah State is not a Georgia defense either. And he does so much with medium volume, I think, and they're starting to give him some more volume because he's done so well. And this is the highest price we've seen him at, and it's it's still very underpriced. Like he should be 8K in this spot, and I would still pay it. I think I don't want to get into a stat line because that's something we may talk about later in the show, but I am expecting a very big game out of Ja'Cory Krosky-Merritt due to both the explosiveness and also the fact that like they are going up against such a downtrodden and injured defense, and their philosophy is based on running the football. They're not going to throw it a lot. They do have the two quarterback system with Hopkins and Dampier, and really their job is to just hand off to Krosky-Merritt. Like that's all they're going to really want to do, and they're going to have a lot of success doing it. So big takeaway is follow the injury news on Utah State side, because that dictates everything else that you'll do with them. And I think as long as it's not Levi Williams, there are very much pieces that we can get from them. We just don't know who they are yet. And then massive interest, flag planting happening in Ja'Cory Krosky-Merritt on the other side.
Yeah, the Utah State rush defense is bottom tier. They've given up, I believe it's 25 rushing touchdowns so far. It's just it took me a few weeks, like early in this season on some of the like late night slates, he was on it. And I was looking at it, not really believing in him. Like, nah, this can't be the real thing, but he's been consistent, man. I don't think he's had a single game all year where he didn't put up double-digit fantasy points, and he was kind of like toiling in the mid 4K range for a lot of the slates he did make appearances on. So I absolutely feel like he's definitely a main team running back. So I'm with you entirely.
Is there industry buzz around him, or are we have to worry about ownership being too high?
I don't. Meaning that I think there will be ownership. Because I'm thinking back to those secondary slates. He did have it because he was like 4-4. I don't know that he'll be like the super high owned running back, but I definitely think there'll be some, just because yes, Utah State is so bad. Both defenses are horrible. But yeah, I don't even care. Like I'm 100% on board with using him, because they're just going to run it a lot now that he's getting volume. Like hell yeah. They do have a couple of receivers that are cheap, just like everyone else, like Caleb Medford. But I think you're right. Like, can't really rely on any of their receivers. It just seems way too good to play Krosky Merritt and have him perform like a 9K running back, honestly. Like, he could have the Ollie Gordon game. I'm entirely agreeing with you on that. Like, he's just way too good of a spot to pass up. And I don't know. I'm feeling like we're gonna have like way a lot of salary. I might end up just paying for all those Memphis guys because I don't know what we're gonna have.
It does seem like that. Yeah.
All right, next game, UTSA versus Tulane. Tulane's 3.5-point favorites, 52 over under. Starting with the Tulane side, we know we got our guy Michael Pratt. I haven't really done a lot of talking about Tulane. I don't think they've been on a main slate for a while, maybe the Tulsa game, but they have been really sharp. Pratt hasn't been putting up the monster games quite as much, but he's just been so efficient that he hasn't had to like throw 50 times. He hasn't been rushing a lot, although when he came back from injury, it seems like maybe they put a halt on that for now. It has come out, at least, I don't know if he officially came out, but his team, if you will, has mentioned that he's going to be looking to hit the portal at the end of this year. So it would make sense for him to utilize these last couple of games as a way to kind of showcase. But at the same time, I think people know what they're getting. And if he hits the portal, those high major teams are going to come calling regardless. 8-2 is a fine price for him. UTSA is a team that he can definitely take advantage of. But we're going to go right back to Mekhi Hughes. DK just doesn't want to price him up. He went up from 58 to 59. The Tulsa game, 19 carries, 131 yards. He's just getting the massive volume. He's playing over 80% of the snaps. There's really no other running back that's going to threaten to take work for him unless there was an injury. And they have talent. Like Shedro Lewis is a guy who, if he were to get carries, I think he'd be fine. Clayton Johnson, who has missed a couple of games, he would be fine if he got volume, but it's just like they believe in Mekhi Hughes, and he's getting a heavy amount of work. He did eclipse 1,000 rushing yards now after that big performance. Only 10 receptions for 60 yards. He's not going to give us a lot there, but he's only 5'9". So you can use him. You can use, Krosky Merritt, and you're only using a very small portion of your salary for two running backs that both might hit 25 to 30 fantasy points in their respective matches, their matchups. So I'm pretty excited about both, especially with the salary. The receiver spot, it's tough for Tulane. Keys is not going to play. That's already been confirmed. A chance he misses beyond as well. We'll see. And then Jaquan Jackson, who's kind of their 1A to 1B to 1A thing. He's dealing with an ankle issue, which can be tricky. He's officially questionable. I think he'll end up sitting out too, but we'll see, just because of those ankles. So it does make their WR3 usually extremely interesting. Chris Brazel's at 5'9" now. Price has gone up after a big game against FAU in which he caught 7 passes for 103 yards and a touchdown. Any passing volume that does happen, it's pretty much going to go to him. And then Chris Carter to a lesser extent, who did catch 2 touchdowns in their last game as well. But that's really just going to push a lot more, I think, running touches to Mekhi Hughes. So it kind of solidifies that for me. On the UTSA side, I got to say, we haven't had them on the slate as much, but even when we did, it's kind of been disappointing. I guess as much as you can say Frank Harris been disappointing as he just dropped almost 70 damn fantasy points against USF, but it's been a kind of a weird season for him. Yeah, I thought he would have a lot more slate breaking type performances. Again, the Roadrunners weren't on the slate as much this year. Coming off that big performance, it has caused his price to just jack way up there to almost 9K. He has the rushing upside, which obviously we saw in that game, 112 rushing yards, 3 touchdowns. He also threw for 400 yards and 3 touchdowns, just like stupid video game-esque type performance. I don't know that he'll have that game against Tulane, who does have a decent enough defense. I think it puts him somewhere between 25 to maybe 30 fantasy points at best. But you're dedicating a lot of salary there. And I like Frank Harris. I've always liked him. And like I said, I've kind of been disappointed with him this year with the way he's performed and the team in general. GPP play, certainly exposure there for you MME guys, but I don't think he's a priority. The running back situation for UTSA, Corian Barnes was dressed, ready to go. ended up barely playing just a handful of snaps, which I know hurt because that was a smaller slate and we had some Barnes exposure and it didn't work out. So I do think he ends up playing in this one, but it's really too scary to use him. 7-1. We have at least 4, 5, 6 other running backs that we have either talked about or about to talk about that I would place above Barnes. So I don't even have to really consider him or worry myself about him. Robert Henry would be the guy to own if he can't go, but he's 6-1. We're not really getting a discount there either. And also Rocco Griffin is pilfering enough workload that it's kind of just easy to ignore them all. The wide receivers getting all of that volume, if there's a way to beat Tulane, it generally can be through the air with their secondary giving up some plays. You have Joshua Cephas there, 102 targets on the year, 76 catches, 966 yards, 9 touchdowns. He's about to be coasting into another 1,000-yard season. WR2 on the team, Devin McCune, 58 targets, 37 catches, 489 yards, 3 touchdowns. Then you have Tyke Ogle-Kellogg, 52 targets, 29 catches, 514 yards, and 7 touchdowns. And then their tight end, who is decent enough as a value, 37 targets, 28 catches, 260 yards, and a score. Cephas comes in at only 6'5". He's really cheap. If you want exposure to him, I think it's a great idea. He's going to get peppered with targets, double digits usually. That 163 and 1 performance was a really good one for him. But even in a tough matchup, he's going to churn out a lot. If he was like 7.5 or even 8K, like he probably should be, I could walk away from this one, but I think at 6'5", he's just got way too much upside here in a game that's going to have, a fair amount of points, I would say. And even in, games where possession time, was a problem, like against Army, he still put up a big 20-plus fantasy point game. He's just like the only game in town, pretty much. Ogle, Kellogg, and McCune and Cardenas, they're solid, especially with all this passing volume. But just neither of those guys are to the level of like DeCorian Clark, who obviously hasn't been able to play. So it's a lot of Cephas there. GPP wise, you can look at McCune at 4.9. He had 791 and 1. Typically another sub 5K option that we can look at. He's going to be somewhere between 3 to 5 catches each game. So we can definitely live there. Ogle Kellogg at 5K. He's really hit or miss. No consistency with his touches, but he has a lot of touchdown equity in the offense. Not really cheap enough to probably consider for your main lineup, but obviously he's going to get work. He's going to be on the field. But coming away from this one, Mekhi Hughes, 100%. Maybe Cephas. I mean, like I said, we're going to have to spend our salary somewhere. And looking at it, it's probably going to end up being like we just pay for Luther Burden's kind of where my head's at, and perhaps go to Trader, because otherwise there's really nowhere else to spend our money. The top most expensive receiver is Burden. Then you have Newton, Vaughn, Restrepo, who we talked about all three of those guys as being good but not great options, and then Cephas is next. So I do like him quite a bit as a lack of options on the slate, but also just a target hound. It's going to get all the work. So that's where I'm at with this one. A really high scoring slate, I think, is going to be coming up here because of all these low prices. Do you find yourself wanting either of those quarterbacks? I generally a year ago, if you would have said, man, this Harris versus Pratt matchup next year, you wait till you see this, I'd be super jacked for it. But I don't feel that same level of confidence in those guys right now, I guess.
Yeah. I mean, if we'd seen like the previous version of Frank Harris show up against like a couple other teams besides USF, I'd probably have a little bit more of a lean to it, but it's kind of like, well, is he good again, or was he just playing a terrible defense? Right. And everybody's good against a terrible defense. And I think, Tulane, it's not like they're some stalwart defense, but they're a lot better than USF. And so I think a lot of people will see that, especially the game log watchers. They'll see that game pop. And, oh my God, how can I not use Frank Harris at this price? And it's like, well, You're not going to get that same level of efficiency. I don't think he's going to score 17 rushing touchdowns this week. So, I think if I'm using one of the two, it's probably more likely to be Pratt, but I would kind of just prefer to use Hughes out of the backfield and stick to my Daquan Finns or something more along those lines.
All right, next game on the slate, we have an SEC battle here. Missouri versus Arkansas. 8.5-point favorites are Missouri, 55.5 total. Get a chance to talk about Cody Schrader. Man, this Missouri offense has suddenly turned into a very fun fantasy group. I don't think I mean Burden we saw, but Schrader, man, I don't know. I didn't see him having a this crazy of a season, and now he's going to be one of the best backs in all of CFB DFS. So take it away. How much Schrader are we going to have, and who else in this game can we look at?
Yeah, I mean they finally priced him up over 7K. He started the year at that price point, and then for whatever reason, despite all of the success, we've been seeing him at like the 6K, 6.2, 6.5. I don't know why. I'm playing him. I don't know what they're doing, but price is up a little bit here. Should have a lot of success. The one thing I kind of just want to talk about from a narrative standpoint, it feels a little bit like the Florida Arkansas game from earlier in the season. Florida had just come off an emotional, physical loss against Georgia, and they came out kind of flat, ended up losing to Arkansas in that one. And I don't think a lot of people expected that to happen. Missouri, not that they lost, but they played a much tighter game against Florida than I think a lot of people were expecting, especially for the context of Florida having, well, yes, it was Graham Mertz that they lost, but they lost their QB1 in that game, and Florida still managed to compete. And Missouri, that came down to like a game-winning field goal, right? And they had to make some crazy plays to get to the point where there was a game-winning field goal. A lot of energy was expended to win a game that they should have won handily, and a lot of times it can be a letdown spot, especially like against an Arkansas, where it's like, well, they're not really like our big rivals. Like LSU's that team, right? And so I don't know that it's enough of a letdown spot for me to get off of like a Schrader and a Burden, but I also like, it makes me think it's going to be a more competitive game where it will be underwhelming initially on the Missouri side, and it'll be Arkansas kind of controlling the game, despite their overwhelming lack of running backs. And where I'm going with all of this is like, I think we might just get another crazy KJ Jefferson game. They are down to AJ Green or AJ Green. Is it AJ Green? Yeah, it is AJ Green. I second guess myself. AJ Green and Augustave as the running backs. And so like neither of them are going to get 20 carries. Like that's not a thing that is going to exist within this offense. And maybe we get some Dom Johnson in there. He had 6 carries last week and looked pretty good, but it was against FIU. But the running back work is going to be spread out is the point. And so when that happens, when there's not a Rocket Sanders to give it to, and he hasn't been right all year. But when there's not that, it becomes KJ feels like he's got to kind of take over. And we did see that happen in the Florida game. He threw it 31 times, which is a lot for him. And then also ran it 17 times, and he's ran it a lot this year, 159 carries, and only got in the end zone twice. And so we're using KJ Jefferson because we want a rushing touchdown or more, or maybe 100 yards and a rushing touchdown out of him. And we haven't seen a lot of that happen this year, but I think this is a spot where he's kind of primed to do it. He'll be involved in the offense. And then, we'll be able to use Schrader and Burden more because this game will stay competitive longer than, the talent of these two teams might otherwise reflect. That's the narrative I'm going for, right? So, yes, we want to use Schrader and Burden. I'm not as super interested in Brady Cook. Just, at that price point, I think we can do better in terms of rushing upside out of a QB. He doesn't bring a lot of that to the table. And Schrader gets so much volume that like it's not like they're passing it to Burden and then throwing 20 other passes. They're kind of just giving Burden his volume and then everybody else is fighting for scraps. And, big fantasy score out of Theo Weiss last week, but it was one catch for 77 yards and a touchdown. And so that's not like a super sticky, repeatable thing that's going to happen every week. And so if you're betting on volume, yeah, Burden is absolutely the bet. And I want to get him into as many lineups as possible, but I don't see this as like a game stackable thing necessarily in terms of using both quarterbacks, but I do see, using KJ and one of Schrader or Burden, or KJ and Schrader and Burden. That's probably as much of a game stack as I would want to be. And then I'm because of the lackluster effort I think we're going to get from the Missouri side, I'm not as in on those ancillary receivers like Weiss and Cooper as I would otherwise be. And then as far as the receiving game on the Arkansas side, it's rough. I know if we're using KJ, we have to at least consider using receivers, but he's kind of like a Finn where it's almost a little bit detrimental to force a receiver in there. It's not like he has a dominant target. I guess Andrew Armstrong is the most consistent, but not explosive of the bunch. And there's nobody that really jumps off the page. I've been wanting it to be Isaiah Satania week for about 2 years, and he hasn't exceeded 3 catches in that time. So, I guess we could give him a shout again. He's only 3,900. And if you want a cheap pairing option with KJ, you could do that, but I don't really see the need for that. Feels like we're forcing that. We have a lot of other cheap receivers we want to play elsewhere. So I think you can just stick to KJ, Schrader, and Burden from this one.
Yeah. And I feel like the chances of Schrader being super high owned are very, very huge. He's just been so good, kind of like the way that Ollie Gordon had been crushing, and we saw just astronomically high ownership. I think that'll be the case with Schrader, but he's been so good. And like I said, salary wise, I think we'll just end up having enough for Burden, honestly. And the Arkansas side, even Jefferson, man, I'm just so turned off by him this season, but with all his running backs out, it makes sense for him to be getting a lot more rushing touches. All right, the last game on the slate, Air Force versus Boise State. Now, Air Force will be without their quarterback, their usual quarterback, Zach Larrier. They will also be without their top running back, Emmanuel Michel, who is apparently not an injury, or it might be, they're saying, but the staff has said it's going to be a while before he returns. So if it would have been an injury, you feel like they would just say it. So he must have done something that was unsavory, because he ain't going to play. What we saw last week for Air Force, at least with their rushing, was the next quarterback up, Jensen Jones, 19 carries, 95 yards, 2 touchdowns. So expect a lot of work for him. Owen Burke, who's kind of the back, fullback, whatever you want to call it, 14 carries for 65 yards. John Lee Eldridge, 9 carries for 70 yards, did score a touchdown. Dylan Carson, 16 carries, 88 yards. And then Cade Harris came in there as a receiver and rushed twice for 33 yards. So I'm curious. You don't need to play a guy like Dylan Carson, but at 3.5, if he kind of soaks up that Michelle role, it's certainly intriguing. I don't think the matchup against Boise State really favors the Falcons all that much, but this kid is going to get a ton of work. It seems like back-to-back weeks over double-digit carries. Just a really solid look at 3.5, and I think you will see ownership because of it. But there are so many other cheap options that we really don't need to use him, and I do think there's some downside there, right? Because even though he's getting that work, how easy would it be for Eldridge to come in and score twice, or Burke comes in there and he gets every goal line carry, or the Jensen kid comes in and is like, nope, we're calling his number each time. And for that matter, at 6'4", he's certainly worth a look, I guess, against Boise State, but he's very low end to me. Just obviously we know there's going to be a lot of running. And how does that affect the Boise State offense? Probably a decent amount because of, time of possession and everything else. The big question is like, do we go out there and grab Ashton Jenney, who is just like the most amazing running back for the first like 7 weeks of the season? Then it became a joke of like, well, I wonder where he's going to play next year in the transfer portal. Obviously, the return back in week 9 of George Holani has led to a situation where they're just a split backfield. And Ashton missed a couple of weeks there as well, and Holani kind of came back at the right time. But they played both against Utah State. They put up a ton of points, 45. What we saw from Jenney was 12 carries, 85 yards, a touchdown. Also 2 receptions for 23 yards. I want to call him old man Holani, 15 carries, 180 yards, 2 touchdowns, 1 reception for 9 yards. So definitely a split backfield there at this point. Holani would be the one to use at 6'3" because of the discount, but there is that concern there with, well, how many carries are they going to get? What's the time of possession going to be? Are these Air Force guys going to be able to just milk the clock? So it's pretty tough to get too excited about using either of them. I think it makes a lot of sense, or at least pretty good in GPPs, because I doubt anyone will roster them. Same can be said of Taylon Green, who sits there at 6'7". Green has had games where he's looked like the best quarterback on the planet, but he's had much, much more games where he's just been a regular guy. So I don't really have to worry about using him. Where I want to look is the receiving group here, which is very, very cheap. Again, more cheap receivers at our disposal. All the way down at min price is Austin Bolt. A couple of weeks ago on a late slate for Boise State, when we saw like, half the receiver room is injured. McAllister is gone. He's hit the transfer portal early. Who are they going to use? And I was doing my whole message board thing, and there were 2 names I saw. Austin Bolt and this kid that I'm really excited about, Prince Strachan. And they both caught touchdowns in that game against New Mexico. They both looked really, really good. And Bolt followed up his good performance with no receptions, which may make people a little bit confused. He was on the field, though. He had the most targets on the team at 5. It's just Taylon Green didn't get him a lot to work with, so he didn't turn in any receptions. And then Prince Strachan, 2 targets, caught 1 for 31 yards. Both of them are relatively cheap. Prince 3.7. Again, Bolt is 3K. If you find yourself in a lineup where you want Finn and you've got Penny and a couple of other guys, and you're like, you know what, I want more pay-ups. How can I do that? I want to pay down as much as possible at these 2 receiver spots and perhaps get Burden later on, whatever. You can do that with a 3K Bolt. Again, same negatives of the running backs for Boise State. Time of possession might suffer, but I do think Boise State ultimately ends up controlling this game. Looking at it, total's 46. They're 7-point favorites. I actually like them on the betting side of -7 because I do think that they're able to win by 2 scores. And I ultimately think Boise State does just enough to be relevant. And they're super cheap, so they don't need to be super volume guys. Wouldn't surprise me if Prince caught a touchdown at 3.7. Boom, you're there. 3K Bolt only needs to catch one of those 5 targets. As long as it goes long or he goes to touchdown, like it's just a home run play. So you can use either of those guys. Looking at the rest of the relevant receivers last week, the tight end, Matt Lauder, caught both of his targets. Both of them were touchdowns. So if you want some Lauder action there, if you think that can continue, he is priced at 3.7 as well. Not going to be a regular thing for him, so I would not recommend it, but it is something that we saw. We also saw, pull it back up here, Billy Bowens caught one of his targets, and then it was just a lot of 1 reception stuff from like Holani, Genty, Dudley. Not going to be a high volume attack by any means. So not a priority, but if you need super value and need potential for a touchdown at 3K, Austin Bolt does offer that upside for you if you want it. not going to turn in probably a really low chance of him actually doing so, but it's probably enough if it gets you, Finn, Penny, Bangura, some of these other guys that we've highlighted, Schrader. Like if you're able to just stuff your lineup with 4 or 5 of those guys, then yeah, I'll throw away a spot on Bolt if there's a chance he catches a touchdown for me, and I get 3 other guys who are going to put up 35 plus. Pretty much where my head's at there. News galore on the Air Force side, and there's injuries on both teams, and they probably just want to get through it without more injuries, which isn't really a ringing endorsement of this game, but there are enough cheapies to be at least interested in the hammer game. All right, so that is pretty much the slate, my friends. Breaking it down, we're gonna go into cores, PrizePicks, and then we'll head out. And there's so many receivers, it's gonna be hard for me to pick one. What kind of 3-man core are you sitting on here pre Thanksgiving edition?
So I think we're going Finn at quarterback, Krosky Barrett at running back, and Cephas at wide receiver. I'll let you have Burden on that one.
That's a good group. If it's not Finn, I think it's probably Hennigan. Like the top 2 quarterbacks pretty much for me would be Finn and Hennigan, and I think we can fit them if we want them. At running back, Mekhi Hughes, the true core play there for me. Blake Watson is in that group. Penny Boone, like there's a lot of running backs that I like, just so we know, as usual. And then if I end up having the salary, then yeah, core would be Luther Burden, but I'm going to be paying down at receiver. If I can't get there and I have 4 running backs who are all above 6K, for example, with Hughes, of course, I might go to a guy like Rock Taylor of Memphis. So I'm a little bit expanded there on my core, but you guys know our player pool, I think, is pretty obvious at this point. All right, PrizePicks, pulling that up. There was one I saw on here. Let me get it back here. There, a combo. I like that they do this sometimes. Combo rushing yards. So Gavin Sawchuk plus Cody Schrader. That total is 220.5 rushing yards. So those two together have to rush for 221 plus. I like the opportunity for that to happen. So I'm hitting that over. And then also Cody Schrader plus Taj Brooks, 217.5 rushing yards. 2 super high volume backs, both of them rushing for like $120 each. Yeah. So I'm hitting the over on that as well. Those are 2 gimmicky props, but I feel pretty good about both of those. So I am all in on that. And then there was the Seth Hennigan passing yards prop. I know it's 316.5. I generally don't take passing props over 300 if I can help it. I do think he has a chance for 400 in this game, so I am taking that over 316.5. They've even got his EJ Warner's prop over 300, by the way. So it's just going to be explosive game, fun all around. What kind of props are you looking at?
I think we'll start with any sort of touchdown. And they're giving KJ a 1.5 of any kind of touchdowns. So if you think Arkansas is going to score 2 touchdowns, I think KJ is going to be involved in most of the scoring that happens there. So if you have Arkansas on 2 or more touchdowns, I like that over 1.5 any kind of touchdowns for KJ. I am confused, but willing to take the Blake Watson at 66.5 rushing yards. I'm confused by why it's so low. I'm a little bit nervous about hey, are they going to be splitting carries more than I think they're going to be splitting carries? Because that seems like it's about 20 yards too low. So I'm going to take the over though, and remain confident in my analysis of Blake Watson. And then on the on the receptions tab, I'm gonna go with Drake Stoops over 6 receptions. We didn't get to the Drake Stoops props last week because Dylan Gabriel was injured for half of the game and that connection wasn't there. But I think they are going to be peppering him. So I like that a lot. And then let's see. Try to get one more in here. man. Let's go with Tyler Van Dyke over 1.5 passing touchdowns as well.
I like it. We didn't get a chance really. I was going to try and see if we could talk about the showdown. Didn't get a chance, but there are some props in the Thanksgiving Day game there between Ole Miss and Mississippi State. Our guy Quinshon Judkins, they're giving him a rushing prop of 89.5, and Mississippi State's held some pretty decent running backs under 100. Ray Davis had like 80, but they did give up 144 to Jarquez Hunter, and that was a prop that I was really big on during that week. And Judkins was proving himself to be pretty matchup proof. So anytime we can get a rushing prop for him when it's under 100 yards, gives us a little bit of leeway. I feel like that's a pretty strong play. So minus 115 over 89.5 rushing yards, just something that I can't find myself getting away from there. Seems way too good. And then there are some passing yardage props here. Let's get into that yardage. Bo Nix, he's just a freak. They're getting a chance to play Oregon State. This is in the later slate. It's 308.5, minus 115. They haven't been able to really turn him loose as often, and they finally kind of just said, okay, go put up your video game numbers last week, and wow. Oregon State's defense proved themselves to be stout. My Huskies were able to escape. I do give a little bit more respect to Oregon as a whole. They're just cruising right now, and I think Nix is just going to throw for 350 plus the rest of the way. This is a game they're going to want to show out and prove that they're better than Oregon State before the two split and go their separate ways. And then the anytime touchdown props. Let's get that. I got one more, and then we'll be just about done here. Sawchuck's minus 200 for anytime touchdown, so I'll probably look to put that in something else, but I certainly think he scores and scores easily. And then the first touchdown prop, that one's a little bit more risque, if you will. But Missouri at Arkansas, I feel like Missouri, you said they might come out flat, and that could very well be the case. But that first touchdown, I do think it's going to go to Burden. I think it's like he's been waiting for this, or we've been waiting for this kind of blow up game for him. It's been a couple of weeks where he's been kind of just okay. It's plus 500 for the first touchdown score. I think getting Burden going early on is just going to make a lot of sense for Missouri. So that's worth a shot, a sprinkle, if you will, at plus 500. And then one more, Taj Brooks minus 150 versus Texas. He scores a touchdown every week, so it should be minus 500. Yeah, I don't care if it's Texas. Dude just scores every single week. All right, now we're going to go to the end here. Slate, kind of like slate breakers. We don't really have an official name for the part where you pick a player and give a stat line, but now is the time to present us with the player you feel is going to be a slate breaker and what that stat line might look like.
So hinted at it earlier in the show, but just feeling all kinds of Ja'Cory Krosky merit. It's hard to set the number too high for this guy, but I'm gonna go 275. Well, let's go 25 rushing attempts, 275 yards, and 3 touchdowns for Ja'Cory Krosky merit.
Hell yeah, I love it. And then I got a little one here, and it's not very not very imaginative because he is the highest priced running back on the slate at 7.7, but I just don't know that people are going to pay and use him, Penny Boone. And if he gets anywhere close to 20 carries, I just don't see how he doesn't hit 175 and 3 touchdowns against the CMU defense. So that's going to be mine with the Penny Boone play. I feel pretty positive about that. And overall, I think the slate's going to go very well for us. So that brings us to the end of the show. We appreciate the continued support all through the season. I hope everybody, like I said, that celebrates has a happy Thanksgiving and a really, really enjoyable break with family. Don't forget to watch the Egg Bowl. got to continue to watch sports, maybe get a little action on there, but be ready for Friday morning because we're hitting the ground running fast. Those of you that play CBB, there are slates all day tomorrow as well. So there's no true break for the college sports grinder, but a lot of fun and a lot of money to be made. Jake, I appreciate all your great analysis as well. Hope you have a great holiday and a happy Thanksgiving. And everybody out there, I'll be back Saturday morning for the Q&A show. We will see you next week as well before conference championship week. Crazy how fast the season's going. Take care.